There are some occurrences in life that are pretty universally agreed upon that once you reach them, you've kind of got a win. Milestones of achievement that, once achieved, cause a sense of satisfaction to wash over the achiever, and oftentimes admiration and envy in the onlookers. Folks strive for achievements like these, the sorts of things that are guaranteed to make your parents proud, guaranteed to make you more attractive to mates, and pretty much guaranteed to be a pretty awesome addition to your resume. Things like getting your master's degree or your PhD, hitting your first $100,000 in the bank, or better yet, your first mill. Getting married to the love of your life. These are awesome, and many people achieve these sorts of milestones in their lives. But what about the more lofty or even just downright lucky things that can happen in our lives? Those more rare accomplishments. Things like climbing Mount Everest, hitting the big lotto, becoming president of the United States, or perhaps getting into the Guinness Book of World Records. Well, the subject of today's story not only made it into the book, but he so challenged the notion that this is among those universally praised accomplishments that they actually had to remove the category that he was placed in altogether in future installments of the book. That's right, because today we cover the story of Pedro Alonso Lopez, the 2006 winner of the most prolific serial killer world record and the catalyst for this category to cease. The so-called monster of the Andes certainly lives up to his name, having been responsible for somewhere in the ballpark of 300 murders, all or most of which were young girls. And the worst part? He is not currently incarcerated, nor is he confirmed to be dead. No, in fact, he only served a modest sentence of 14 years in prison for his record-breaking spree, and only a couple more than that in a psych ward before again being released into the world. And thus, the reality of the situation is, he could still walk among us to this very day. When considering the details and magnitude of this story, it almost feels like the stuff of folklore, the archetypal boogeyman tale that likely has some roots in fact, but was greatly exaggerated through the years. Hundreds of children being snatched up, never to be seen again, and with no answers as to where they have gone. The mystery surrounding how a being capable of this is never seen or suspected, that this many children could be gone without a trace and not even their remains be found. Some of this could be true, but how could all of it be? It's just so extreme. If I were living in those times and taking all of the available information into account, I don't think I would assume these disappearances were the work of one depraved man. I would likely have believed it was either a network of several criminals working together for some sort of nefarious goal. In fact, one of the reasons cited for the police's lack of effort in the beginning was because they assumed the children were going missing in order to be put to labor as a live-in maid, which they believed would be a better fate for them than the way they were living prior to going missing. I even know an individual that I was talking to about this story, and their first question to me when I told them that outrageous number was he part of the cartel? Was this cartel activity? And I had to specify, no, this was all the work of one person, acting simply for his own sick gratification. He was pretty shocked by that revelation. Now, this notion that the children were better off being live-in maids than the way they were living before might sound cruel and hard to believe, and there certainly is a failure on the authorities' part for their complacency and unwillingness to look further into these crimes, but you'll understand that perspective a little more clearly once we get into the circumstances of the setting that this case takes place in. It's a setting characterized by war, rebellion, assassinations, and impoverished street children doing whatever they need to do just to survive. It was a time where death, torment, and misery are not special cases, but just another Tuesday. However, unfortunately for the people of Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia, this was no fictional story, and it was not in the least exaggerated. In fact, as they say, truth is stranger than fiction. In this case, the truth is more horrifying than fiction, too. Because I don't believe even in the darkest of imaginations could anybody dream up a worse story than this. So brace yourself, because we're going back to the start, in war-torn Colombia, where the story of the monster of the Andes begins, interestingly enough, before he was even born. But first, before we get into any of that, I just want to say thank you for watching, and welcome back to the Walk in the Dark Show. I'm your host, Justin. The year is 1948, and the place is the city of Bogota, Colombia. Political tensions were high here as conservative and liberal factions within the country were butting heads harder than a bull seeing red. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, this pressure would finally be released, but not in any productive or helpful manner. On April 9th of this same year, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, the leader of the Liberal Party and frontrunner for the presidency, was assassinated by Juan Sierra. The response to this event was much akin to that of a gas tank being shot in your favorite action movie or video game. Explosive. Civil war broke out immediately in Bogota and surrounding cities. Towns were burned, thousands were killed, and the lives of those that remained were dramatically changed. Unfortunately, as is often the case in war, civilians were often collateral damage, and Pedro's father, Medardo, was no different. He was killed in the chaos the day of the assassination while his son was yet unborn, leaving his mother, Benilda, alone to provide for Pedro and his 10 other siblings. You did hear that right. With the inclusion of Pedro, there were 11 children living under the roof of that house. Benilda was in a tough situation, and so unfortunately she would have to turn to sex work to keep food on the table and that roof over all those kids' heads. Though it doesn't take a degree in psychology to know this line of work is not the most conducive to raising children in a healthy environment, there are a few key details in this particular circumstance that add to the dysfunction. For one, the size of the family relative to the size of the house, which was basically just a small shack, led to little to no buffer zone between the children and Bonita's work. If you caught the implication there, congrats. She was meeting with her Johns at the family home, and the only thing separating her children from the noise of these encounters was a thin curtain. As the large family all lay and tried to sleep, in one bed, mind you, they would hear and possibly see, depending on the opacity of the curtain, what was going on in the other part of the house. But unfortunately, they were not simply exposed to the disturbing reality of their mother pleasuring strangers in exchange for cash, but many of her clients were also violent towards her and abused her during these sessions. I need not go into great detail as to how this would be psychologically damaging for the children, but specifically on the abuse side of things, this would have caused the young Pedro to associate violence with sexual expression, an association that would come to maturity and be manifest through his actions in the years to come. But far before we get anywhere near his massive killing spree, at the tender age of 8 years old, Pedro would begin to inappropriately touch his sister. This would not sit well with their mother once she was made aware of this fact, and no wonder. It is never welcome news to find out that your daughter has been hurt in this manner, and certainly not coupled with the fact it was her own brother that did it. But Bonilda was not the nurturing, understanding kind of mother that would try her best to do what was right by her kids despite her flaws. No, because reports from those that know this family suggest she was the beat the children with a broom and add to the trauma I'm already putting them through with my lifestyle kind of mother. So upon learning this, she stayed true to that reputation. She did not do what most of us would, seek psychiatric help for both siblings in order to help mitigate the underlying cause of this behavior. She instead responded violently. She reportedly burned the bottom of young Pedro's feet, then promptly kicked him out of the house. For good. So this ends the era of Pedro's home life. But if you thought that that was bad, things are about to get a whole lot worse in his next chapter, because we're about to exchange that small shack, where at least he had a roof over his head and a mother to take care of him, for the streets. And say what you will about his mother, she certainly isn't going to win Mother of the Year anytime soon, but she was willing to do what she had to do in order to feed and care for the children. And now, Pedro would be put in a position where he would need to do what he needed to do to survive. And much like was the case with his mother, that would often include, let's say, unethical means. And of course, to state the obvious, homelessness is not an ideal situation to be in, especially when you're a child. But it was even less so in the middle of the so-called La Violencia War, literally the violence, that was still raging in the area at the time. And sadly, Lopez's situation was not uncommon at this time in Bogota. Pedro, like many others, would need to steal in order to survive, and he would specialize in the tried and true skill of stealing and selling car parts. It was a hard life, and he would be exposed to more sexual immorality during this time. At one point, a man would assault him and then toss him back out to the harsh reality of the streets. At another time, he seemed to have caught a break, perhaps even a miracle, when at around age 10, an American couple saw and took pity on him. They took him to a local orphanage and paid for him to stay there. What luck! He once again had a roof over his head, and though orphanages don't have the best reputation for their living conditions, it had to have been better than anything he experienced up until this point. However, tragedy seemed to follow this young man wherever he went, as even here he was assaulted by one of the male teachers. So he ran away again, back into the uncertainty of homelessness. Life would continue down this path for him until the law would finally catch up with his auto parts business. At age 18, he was now being sent to prison. It is unknown how long exactly his sentence was, but during his time in the big house, he was again assaulted, likely on an ongoing basis. It is unclear as to how many assailants there were, but it seems to have been around 3 or 4. It was at this point, evidently, that something finally snapped inside Pedro. He would not take this disrespect lying down. No, he made up in his mind that the world would no longer treat him like its own personal plaything, but that he was going to take back control. The prey would become the predator. And every predator needs its fangs. He fashioned a knife and systematically cut the throat of every one of his attackers, one by one. For the first time, the monster of the Andes would spill the blood of another, and if his actions that soon followed were any indication, he was quite happy with his work. He would later be quoted as saying it was his, quote, mission to kill. And this was when he first received that dark calling. These murders would earn him 2 more years on his sentence, but as we do not know the length of the original sentence, we also don't know exactly how long it was until his release, but he would have been somewhere in his 20s and released sometime after 1970. It was now time. He was released back into the world that had chewed him up and spit him out, the world that didn't allow him his innocence. He was ready to release all the rage that was building up inside of him out upon every innocent he could find. If there was light, he would extinguish it. If there was a child that seemed to have what he was not allowed to have, he would make sure to take it from them. The monster was born, and he would waste no time beginning the hunt. Upon his release, Pedro would move to Peru, where he would immediately begin kidnapping, raping, and killing girls. He targeted indigenous women, likely for the same reason many American serial killers target sex workers. In Peru, indigenous people were considered lower elements of society, so he likely figured society and, more instrumentally, the authorities would not take much notice. And unfortunately, this strategy did seem to work. One source suggested that one of the reasons authorities may have ignored requests and complaints about all of these missing people was because they believed the girls were kidnapped for the purpose of becoming live-in servants, and that they were just better off for it. Due to this, and likely multiple other factors, this monster would later confess to having raped and murdered over 100 girls by 1978, less than 10 years after his release from prison. And he was only getting started. Now, if the chances of the young Pedro being rescued from the streets and put up in an orphanage were 1 in a million, what happens next is 1 in a billion, so I would love to know the synergy of both of these insanely improbable events happening to one person, also factoring in that the one person that this happened to happens to be the most prolific serial killer ever. What you're about to hear is difficult to believe, but I assure you this actually happened. Please, feel free to fact-check me, but I am telling you, this actually happened. During a trek through South Peru, some intuitive locals suspected Pedro of being responsible for some of the missing children in the area. So they promptly tied him up and decided, hey, since the authorities won't do anything about this, maybe we should do it ourselves. Some regular Good Samaritans. Some of the possible methods they proposed included loading him with honey and leaving him for the ants to eat. Wow. Or simply burying him alive. Yeah. But they decided to simply burn him and throw his ashes on the dung pile. The end. Is what I would like to say happened. But while deliberating on the horrific ways they would end this freak, a white woman from America came to save the day. Somehow, someway, she convinced this ravenous mob that had what they believed to be their mass murderer tied up and ready to be burned, or whatever they were going to decide to do. She somehow talked them into, not doing that. And she had convinced them that she was going to take him right to the police, which they knew weren't going to do anything. But she didn't take him to the police. No, she drove him to the border and said, "Go on home." Yep. She obviously did not bother to check with the locals as to, why they were all collectively trying to kill this guy and why they were so very upset. She must have just assumed they were just crazed savages, but you'd think she would have probably figured out that that wasn't the case when she was able to reason with them. So, I'm sure she thought she did her good deed for the day. However, I will say she couldn't have really known exactly what was going on based on the information that she had to work with, what was before her. She was just stopping a homicide and saving an innocent man from being brutally murdered. But things are not always what they seem, and what she actually did was allow a killer's horrific story to continue, adding hundreds of more bodies to his resume. After this brush with death, he would go to Ecuador and continue to hunt girls there. He typically targeted girls that were with their mothers, waiting for the opportunity that they would separate from them and snatch them up then. Like a true boogeyman, he would keep fascinating trinkets in his pocket and lure the children away with those. He was quoted as saying he would only kill during the day because he liked to look into his victim's eyes, and he could not properly savor the experience in the dark. I'm reminded of what the weepy-voiced killer said about killing in our last episode, how it was just a normal and expected part of life in his eyes. It seems that Pedro saw murder as a part of life too, but if Stefani saw it as a mundane part of life, Pedro saw it as a delicacy, the good things in life, so to speak. A remarkably evil man. In his quest to exact maximum enjoyment from each victim, he would also arrange them together in holes and talk to them. He said they enjoyed the company, but I suspect even in his twisted mind he knew this was just a control thing. He wanted to disrespect his victims even in death, and he enjoyed the idea that his control over them extended beyond the grave. But the locals were not just sitting on their hands while all this was going on. They would put up posters warning that there was a monster on the loose coming after their children. Society would warn each other, and the mothers were keeping a close eye out on their children, and it wouldn't be long until this hypervigilance would pay off. The police were also more intentional during this time to investigate the matter, but now it seemed it wasn't due to lack of motivation or neglect that was hindering his capture, but his elusive nature. Regardless of this, his sins would soon be found out, and the search intensified. In April 1980, or some sources cite 1979, the Rio Ambato River in Ecuador rose due to severe flash flooding and torrential rains. This environmental event caused the river to overflow its banks near the city of Ambato, which unearthed the shallow graves of 4 young girls who had previously been reported missing. This was the beginning of the end for the monster of the Andes, because it would not be long after this event that he would be found out, and it would be the mother of his next potential victim that would end his reign of terror. The woman's name was Carlina Ramona Poveda. Some sources say she was a vendor in the market that day, while others state she was a shopper. I tend to believe the latter, as this seems like the most natural conclusion when hearing the details of the rest of the story. Carlina was walking with her daughter in the market, spotting out goods to purchase, when she noticed a strange man ominously skulking by them and watching them. Every mother in the area was on high alert due to the disappearances, so she was certainly keeping an eye on the situation. But before she knew it, she turned around and the man had managed to draw Carlina's daughter away with his signature trinket lure. But this time, he was spotted. She began to yell and call for help, and though Pedro tried to run away with his prey, he would be detained by the shopgoers and, once again, tied up. But this time, he wouldn't be driven to the border to escape. The police would come. He was very tight-lipped during the interrogation, so the authorities, according to reports, did beat and even torture him to get him to talk, but to no avail. Everyone present was convinced they had their man, so they arrested him and put him in prison with a plan to make him talk. They put an undercover officer in the cell with him who tried to befriend the killer. The officer was reportedly terrified, as I think we all would be, and even wrapped a towel around his neck in hopes this would offer some degree of buffer should Pedro try to strangle him in the night. I'm not sure how effective that would have been, but I hope it gave the officer some peace of mind so he could get some sleep during this stressful assignment. Thankfully, his difficult and terrifying work would not be in vain, as eventually Lopez would begin to talk about his crimes, and not with any kind of slow trickle. He, like so many arrogant monsters before him, just could not help but brag about his accomplishments. It would seem that letting it all out was somewhat relieving to the killer, as when he found out he was had, it didn't seem to bother him too much. He agreed to show the police the graves of his victims, and they would end up going to over 50 graves. He, unfortunately, quite enjoyed this, reminiscing about the good times he had doing what he did. Reportedly, he would even jump into the graves of his victims and request a photo with them, taking up body parts and posing. I imagine the police were horrified at this, but they had to grit their teeth and carry on with the macabre work if they wanted the evidence to bring closure to as many families as possible. At this time, he would be charged with a staggering 110 murders, though this is only a fraction of the total murders he is believed to have committed, which is over 300. Though the mass murderer was finally behind bars, the public could not yet breathe a sigh of relief. Not because they were still unsafe, but because they were far too overcome with rage and bloodlust to feel any emotion approximating relief. There was reportedly a bounty raised by the families of the victims for $31,000 for his death, but the prison was aware of this and greatly tightened security. Nobody was going to get to this guy. Now, if only the authorities had protected the children of their cities with this much fervor, maybe things would have turned out a bit differently. During his time in prison, a reporter by the name of Ron was allowed to interview Pedro, but the killer said he would only cooperate if he could touch the hands of the prison warden's daughter. Obviously, the warden initially declined. But when she assured them it was okay, brave woman, and because Pedro assured them that she was too old for him to take any interest in her and he would not hurt her, they allowed it. This was probably just another sick power play on his part, and thankfully he did keep his word and he did not hurt her. He did hurt Ron, though. When Pedro met him, he gave him an unnecessarily firm handshake and reportedly hurt Ron quite a bit, causing his hand to turn red. Pedro spoke candidly with Ron. He told him everything. He didn't have much to lose at this point, and that's not just because he was already caught. Pedro had no reason to hold back because the maximum sentence, even for the crimes that he committed, was 16 years. 16 years for over 300 bodies, 300 lives lost, and all he loses is 16 years. Now again, I know this is probably hard to believe, but again, I invite you to fact-check me on this. During this same interview, Pedro unashamedly said he would kill again upon release, and this is when he is quoted as calling it his mission to do so. But don't worry, if you thought 16 years was too lenient, he was initially released on August 31st, 1994, which was actually 2 years earlier than he was supposed to be released. Get this, for good behavior. So he actually spent 14 years in prison. But thankfully, Ecuadorian police had a plan for this, and they arrested him shortly after his release for being an illegal immigrant and sent him back to Colombia, where he would be charged with a different murder. They put him in the psych ward, though, just to make sure he was sane enough for trial. He was not. The psychiatric conditions in Colombia took into account their war-torn state, and, if you recall, much of Pedro's trauma was directly related with the war. But hey, it's not exactly the torturous retribution everybody wanted him to face, and it's not even the second best thing, him being uncomfortable in a prison cell. But at least it's the third best. He would certainly never make it out, since he would obviously never be anything close to sane. Again, is what I would like to say, but nope. A few years and $50 bail is all it took, and the wolf was back among the sheep. Nobody knows exactly how he received this clean bill of mental health, but one thing is for sure, this never should have happened. None of this should have ever happened. Upon his release, he returned home to see his mom. Sounds sweet, but he just wanted money from her. She didn't have any, so he kissed her goodbye and left to make amends for his sins. Again, not really. He sold her stuff and left her in a worse state than she was before, and then disappeared into the night. Nobody knows what happened to him after this, even to this day. It is actually possible that he is still alive, still walking among us. If so, he would be 77 years old today. So, Justin, what does the Walk in the Dark show think happened? Well, I'm glad you asked. We've already established that all of his victims' families were out for blood. He no longer had those high and cozy walls to hide behind, and the guards in the prison were no longer protecting him, and I doubt he was able to hire private security. We also know that there's no way he was going to just live a normal life at this point. He had declared it his mission to kill people. So if he was still out there, he still would be killing. And if he was still killing, he would be doing it on a massive scale, and if he was doing it on a massive scale, we would have noticed. So what I think happened was he was out in the wild, and somebody that knew what he was either ran into him, or he was specifically targeted and tracked down, and whoever that was made sure he would never hurt anyone ever again, or do anything else ever again. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think the monster of the Andes still walks among us, sipping margaritas on a beach somewhere, living out his twilight years? Or do you think, kind of the way I think, that he's probably dead and gone and we'll never hear from him ever again? Let me know down in the comments what you think, and while you're down there, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. You know, with every new case, I keep thinking this has got to be the bottom of the bottom, and then I keep surprising myself. But this one has really got to be it. I really hope so. But until next time, this has been the Walk in the Dark Show. I'm your host, Justin. Thank you for watching, and remember, you can take a walk in the dark, but always live in the light. God bless.